Welcome to Things You Don't Know. In our continuing series concerning Native Americans, we have something which is really quite fascinating to me and to Dr. Deneen too. So, in this this episode of our series on Native Americans, we want to begin with a question that a lot of people have heard in one form or another, but may never have really kind of unpacked and torn apart and looked at carefully, right, Dr. Deneen?
Right, Dr. Weaver. The question is this, ladies and gentlemen. Did the United States borrow ideas for its Constitution from indigenous peoples?
And more specifically, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called by outsiders the Iroquois Confederacy.
And the short answer is yes, probably in some important conceptual ways, but not in the simplistic word for word way people sometimes claim.
Yeah, and that is perhaps where we need to start with honesty, because sometimes this topic gets handled in two very bad ways. One is to dismiss it completely as though native, indigenous political thought did not influence at all.
And the other way is to overstate it, to say the United States Constitution was basically copied from the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace.
And neither of those versions really does justice to the historical record at all.
No, the more responsible position, Dr. Weaver, is that some of the founders clearly knew native political systems well enough to respect certain features of them, especially the Haudenosaunee model of multiple nations joined in a durable confederacy while retaining local authority. That seems to have mattered, but direct verbal borrowing into the final constitutional text is much harder to prove.
Yeah, but just to re-emphasize that, Dr. Deneen, that concept that you just so eloquently put together in such a simple way. I just want to say it again. Multiple nations joined in a durable confederacy while retaining local authority. Yeah, that really was a new experiment, was it not?
It was.
Okay, and that, even if they didn't borrow anything else, that concept is a lot. So what we're going to do in this episode is separate the solid evidence from overstatement, because that's really what respect requires. So let's start with the basics. Who were the Haudenosaunee?
The Haudenosaunee, often known historically, as we said, as the Iroquois Confederacy, were a league of nations in what is now the northeastern part of North America. Originally, that confederacy included the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later the Tuscarora joined as well.
And the important thing here is that they were not just a collection of neighboring peoples, different tribes, da 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 da. No, they had a confederated political order, a union.
Right, Dr. Weaver, and that union was governed by what is often called the Great Law of Peace, also known as the Great Binding Law. It was a political and moral framework for bringing distinct nations together in peace while allowing those nations to maintain their own traditions and their own internal governance.
That point matters because when the British colonies and later the American states were trying to figure out how separate political entities could unite without simply dissolving into one mass, the Haudenosaunee already had a working example on this continent right here.
Exactly. European philosophers could offer theories. The Haudenosaunee offered a living, functioning example of a union spread over a rather large geographic area.
Yes, and it was very impressive. And it's not just them. There were some other tribal unions too. The Algonquins had a confederation. It wasn't as codified as the Haudenosaunee, uh, but they had it too. And perhaps we should do something about that in a different podcast too.
I'd like that.
Yeah, because the Virginia Algonquins, the Powhatans that we usually call them, they had something going. They had around 15,000 different tribes in their little confederation. Yeah. So when people say the United States borrowed from indigenous peoples, what are they most likely talking about?
What they're usually talking about is political concept, not direct copied paragraphs. The biggest concept is federal union, the idea that separate polities can join together for common purposes while still keeping significant internal control, almost like the European Union today.
Well, almost like the United States today, which is under attack in some ways. So, in other words, unity without total surrender of identity. Now, some states are more particular about that. As a son of Virginia, I take that very seriously.
I know that well, exactly. Under the Haudenosaunee system, the member nations handled their own internal matters, while the Confederacy dealt with matters affecting the whole League, things like diplomacy, peace and war, and broader common interests. That's one of the major similarities people point to. This information came from the Penn Gazette history website.
Yes. And that sounds familiar to anyone who knows even a little bit about the US constitutional system. States with their own powers and a larger union with shared powers.
Yes, although we should add immediately, putting on my historian's cap here, that the two systems were not identical. The Haudenosaunee Great Council was not Congress in the modern American sense or the Canadian Parliament. Their political offices, their social structures, their basis of authority, and their traditions were rooted in Haudenosaunee life, not Anglo American life.
Yes, that's a really important point you bring up. So the strongest case is not the founders copied the Haudenosaunee Constitution. No, that's not quite right. But they did lift some sentences, I am sure.
They did. The strongest case, Dr. Weaver, they observed a successful indigenous confederacy and found in it a working example of union, distributed authority, deliberation, and political continuity across multiple peoples.
Okie dokie. So now let's get to one of the most important names in this conversation. Our good friend that when Dr. Nanina and I are talking about him, we often call him Benny. But let's be a little bit more formal and say Benjamin Franklin.
Dr. Franklin is probably the clearest direct example of a founder who was in meaningful contact with native diplomacy and native political structures. He printed records of treaty councils. He heard indigenous leaders speak. He spent years in a colonial world where native nations were major diplomatic powers, not distant abstractions.
Hmm. And Franklin did something important in 1751. He wrote to James Parker and pointed to the Six Nations as an example of successful union.
Yes, Dr. Weaver, and the wording is very famous. Franklin wrote in substance that it would be a strange thing if six native nations could form a union that had lasted for ages, while the English colonies could not do something similar. That is one of the clearest documentary pieces of evidence that he was constantly looking at the Haudenosaunee as an example of perpetual political union.
And that is significant.
Very significant, because Franklin wasn't just casually admiring them. He was using them as a practical argument for colonial union even long before we thought of independence.
Yes, and that leads us to the Albany Plan of Union.
Right. Benjamin Franklin was a major advocate of the Albany Plan in 1754, which proposed uniting the colonies for mutual defense and coordination. It did not become the U.S. Constitution, of course, but it mattered as an early Union framework, and historians often connect Franklin's thinking there with his awareness of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
So, if listeners ask, which founder seems most demonstrably engaged with native models of governance? Franklin may well be the strongest answer.
Yes, he may. There are others, but Franklin is the safest, most direct, and strongest name to emphasize.
So, what about other founders? Who else was more in touch with native political life and thinking?
Well, as I said, the evidence is strongest for Benjamin Franklin, but he was not alone living in a world shaped by native diplomacy. Thomas Jefferson is often mentioned because he had direct exposure to native leaders and native policies of all kinds, both through Virginia's world and later his role in later national policy. Some historical discussions also note that major figures in the founding generation would have known indigenous governments were real sovereign political powers with whom the colonies, the British Empire, and later on the United States had to negotiate.
So, Jefferson definitely belongs in the conversation, but perhaps not with the same level of documentary clarity as Franklin.
That's a fair way to put it. You can mention Jefferson, and you should, but if you're being precise, Franklin is the one with the most explicit record of tying Native Confederacy to the idea of colonial union.
And what about John Adams?
Adams is interesting because materials prepared around the constitutional era include discussion of indigenous governments alongside European theories of enlightenment. That shows, as we said, native political structures were not invisible to the founding generation. But again, if the question is who was most directly and clearly in touch with native political thought in a way we can document, Benjamin Franklin holds the prize and is the standout.
And that is important what you said, that we can document, written word. That is an important distinction. So for listeners, maybe the clean version is this: many founders knew native nations were politically sophisticated and important. Franklin was a clear example of someone who explicitly invoked Haudenosaunee Union as an example.
You're exactly right.
So, were there actual phrases in common? Yes. Now we need to get to the question people always want answered. Were there actual phrases in common between Haudenosaunee political traditions and American founding documents?
This is where we need to be especially careful. There are indeed ideas, images, and formulations that people compare, but the evidence for significant direct phrase by phrase borrowing into the Constitution is not non existent but somewhat weak.
So, if somebody says the Constitution lifted whole lines straight from the great law of peace, that may be too strong.
Yes, the best supported claim is a conceptual influence. I think there were phrases copied, but there isn't absolute stand up in court proof of proven textual copying into the final Constitution.
Still, there are some parallels worth discussing.
There certainly are. One often mentioned parallel is the emphasis on peace, unity, and strength through union. In Haudenosaunee tradition, one of the memorable images, and we've talked about this on other podcasts, is the bundle of arrows bound together, much stronger than apart. That symbolic logic of unity appears in many places in early American political thinking, including Franklin's well-known emphasis on a union.
Yes, and that picture is iconic. The I mean, we see it on our money, right?
Absolutely,
The eagle holding a bundle of arrows together. Yeah. And there's also the broad language of forming a lasting union.
yes. People sometimes compare the Constitution's phrase in the preamble to form a more perfect union, with Hauditsine traditions centered on creating a durable peace among distinct nations. But again, similarity of political purpose is not the same thing as absolute proof the framers copied wording directly from native sources.
So resemblance does not equal documentary certainty.
Exactly. That's the historian's discipline. We can and should say there are meaningful parallels in the idea of a union among separate peoples, and we can say Benjamin Franklin explicitly admired the Six Nations success at union. What we should not say is that the final constitutional wording is demonstrably lifted line by line from the Great Law of Peace.
Yeah, that's true. It almost feels to me like what we're talking about is some of this being paraphrased, and that makes it difficult to directly connect. Wouldn't you agree, Dr.
I agree.
Levine?
I'm certain there was some paraphrasing or perhaps even a great deal.
Yeah. So, are there any other concepts that seem comparable?
Absolutely. People often point to the idea of federalism or a confederation, representative governance through a council, deliberation and consensus, distributed authority, and a social political culture built around maintaining peace among member nations.
But again, similarity is strongest at the level of structure and imagination, not precisely copied wording, which again goes back to my statement that I think that there was a lot of paraphrasing.
Yes, I think that's the most defensible position.
So let's spend a few minutes on the differences because, yeah, that matters too, you know?
Absolutely. If you only talk about similarities, you can wind up distorting both systems.
Yes, you're so right. So, what are some of those important differences, Dr. Deneen?
Well, one major difference is the Hauditsine system emerged, as we said before, from their own spiritual, kinship, social, and political traditions. It was not a Lockean Enlightenment republic in the European sense. Also, the leadership structure included hereditary elements that American framers did not want in their own system. The framers were rejecting that and reacting against monarchy, titles, and inherited office.
So, even when they admired the Native Confederacy, they were selective.
Very selective. They were not trying to become Hauditsine. They were looking for useful models which could be borrowed from and modified while still building a distinctly Judeo Christian Anglo American constitutional order.
And that order was also shaped by British legal practice, colonial experience, and European thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu.
Yes, to say indigenous influence mattered correctly is not to say it was the only influence. It was one influence among several. We could go back to Switzerland and the Greek city states, to mention only a few. Although the indigenous influence was often one later history minimized or sadly ignored.
Yeah. So, why do you think this part of the story has been so often pushed aside?
Because it's uncomfortable. It complicates the old story that American democracy came almost exclusively from Europe. It forces people to admit that native nations were not just obstacles or background players, as we've said in other podcasts, in the background of colonial history. They were political actors with agency, diplomatic power, and in some cases, examples that colonial leaders diligently studied.
I'm also wondering here if part of this issue is that when the European settlers came to the Americas, what did they call the indigenous people? Savages. And they said a whole bunch of things that were just so way off base and so way wrong.
Yes.
And I think that played a role too. There's also the bitter irony that some founders could admire aspects of native governance while still holding prejudiced views of native peoples.
Yes, and Franklin's own language, I'm sorry to say, shows that contradiction. He could point to the Six Nations as a successful model of union while still using at best paternalistic and at worst insulting language about them, uncivilized, children of nature, and I'm sorry to say savages. That contradiction tells us something painful but important that we see over and over again in history. A people can learn from another people without fully honoring them.
And that happens more often in history, as you mentioned, than we'd like to admit.
Far more often.
We should probably mention that this issue wasn't just left to scholars.
Right. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy to the development of the United States government. That recognition matters both symbolically and politically. But even with that recognition, historians still debate how direct the influence was and how far specific claims should go or be accepted.
Yeah, so even there, nuance matters.
Always.
So, if we had to give our listeners the most accurate conclusion in plain, straightforward English, what would it be?
I would say this: the United States did not simply copy the Constitution from the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. But it is also false to say that indigenous political thought had nothing to do with the American founding. The most careful, easily provable conclusion is that some founders, especially Benjamin Franklin, knew native confederacies well enough to admire and invoke them, and that the Haudenosaunee offered a real world example of union, distributed governments, and peace among distinct nations at a time when the colonies and later on the states of the United States were trying to solve exactly that kind of political problem.
And if listeners ask, what exactly was borrowed? What would the best answer be?
More likely concepts and ideas than sentences, more likely structure than wording, more likely political imagination than direct textual copying.
So, a kind of paraphrasing many times. And I think that that's pretty well said, Dr.
Thank,
Levine.
thank you, Dr. Weaver.
I think there's something bigger here, too. This isn't just a footnote to constitutional history. It tells us something about how this country remembers itself.
Yes, if Native peoples are remembered only as obstacles or victims, then we miss the fact that they were autonomous people, thinkers, diplomats, strategists, and lawgivers, and the builders of durable political and social systems.
And that matters morally, not just academically.
It certainly does, because part of respect is being willing to say that wisdom didn't arrive on this continent only in European books. Some of it, my friends, was already here,
Already lived,
already well practiced.
already governing nations.
And that is one of the most important truths this wonderful series wants to recover.
Well, listen, thanks for listening in today. I am so excited about this series. It's near and dear to my heart. And
And to mine,
so This has been Things You Don't Know. Until next time, please come back, give us a like, subscribe, give your comments. If there are specific issues that you would like to see us cover in this area, please let us know. Have a good one. Bye for now.